Hello, everyone, and anyone in search of a quality review of Old World. Unfortunately, you made your way to the bottom of the YouTube barrel and stumbled across a video that at best can be described as little more than some bum's general thoughts on Old World. That being said, I found the game very enjoyable, so much so that within roughly a little over a week, I completely burned it. It was interesting trying out the different playable factions and trying to take advantage of their unique bonuses and attributes as I played, so that was a plus. And my favorite way of playing the game was on the map called Old World, which is essentially an attempt to include the land immediately surrounding the Mediterranean Sea and what I would call the land that composed most pretty much all of Alexander the Great's conquest, and including all the major factions that are usually included in this kind of scenario or setup. However, when it comes to keeping things really interesting in terms of not knowing what's out there, nothing beats a random setup. This is primarily because the early exploration stage of the game offers plenty of things to keep things interesting, like discovering old ruins, deciding where to settle your new cities, and dealing with loosely organized tribes and barbarians that increasingly become irrelevant as the game goes on, as their ability to compete with the more organized, more developed factions fades. The obvious comparison to be made here is to Civilization. Well, while such a comparison is understandable, I'm not so eager to hold this game up against Civilization, specifically Civilization 6, primarily because Civilization 6 has had so much added to it at this point that comparing it to a newly released game runs the risk of viewing Old World as simply a game that lacks what Civ 6 has. I find it more productive, as it actually allows for something to talk about, to point out what Old World does as a game in its own right, as opposed to viewing it as a deficient Civ 6. So, with my justification out of the way, Old World has a lot of things going for it as a grand strategy game. One of the significant things, if not the significant thing, is the internal management of your faction. While you do play the game as this sort of grand mastermind, events, individuals, and families within your chosen faction add a level of intrigue, complication, and benefits that hinder or facilitate your ability to reach your desired goals and of course ultimately win the game. In essence, getting affairs within your own faction in order can be just as important as dealing with other foreign factions. There are a few different ways to interact with other factions. Depending on the actions taken, this could improve or worsen your relationship with them. Pretty common stuff, but Old World manages to keep it interesting by including the occasional event that carries interfactional ramifications. For example, in one of these events, a group of raiders were chased out of Egyptian lands into what I believe were Persian lands. The Persians demanded that the Egyptians take responsibility for the raiders, while the Egyptians viewed the raiders as Persia's problem. The situation was brought to the attention of my faction head, and I chose to side with the Egyptians. I actually sympathized with the Persians, but I couldn't risk upsetting the Egyptians any more than I already had at that moment, as it ran the risk of them declaring war on me again, and I wasn't ready for that. While not the greatest selling point of the game, it serves to highlight all the minor events, relationships, and even individual characters that have an influence on the course of a game. Basically, it's the little things. This can also be seen within the game's combat system. Individual unit promotions are simple enough, but I liked how assigning a general to an individual unit required that would-be general and unit be of the same house or family. The only time that this doesn't apply is with the faction leader, as they're able to assume command of any unit regardless of the family that unit is aligned to. As expected, different units have different combat abilities that stand aside from the general promotions. For example, a catapult can be promoted to have AoE effect, while a polybolus, I think it's polybolus, or ballista type units can deal damage to multiple units in a straight line. Again, not groundbreaking and not a feature that will sell anyone on the game, at least not in and of itself, but one of the many interesting complements that work in conjunction with everything else that the game has going on. It's not all gravy. Not everything that the game tasks the player with doing is great, or even good. I'm still ambivalent about the whole order system they have going on. It's pretty straightforward. Based on a number of different factions, you are provided with a number of orders that can be used to basically move everything in the game. A notable exception to this is what you task your cities to produce or construct and how you handle events. Anyway, I do like how the orders force me to prioritize how and how far I move my units, among other things, but it proved to be a bit more micromanagerial for my taste. For example, I really couldn't just put the workers on automate because they would take up orders that could have been better spent somewhere else. The solution is obviously take control of the workers myself, but individually managing my army of workers was tiresome. However, I do like the relationship between workers and cities. Having workers be responsible for constructing the majority of specialized buildings in a city was a good move. It provided for an engaging way of developing cities and the land around them. What else? Oh, just a few more notables. The art style and direction was an interesting mix of realism and what I would call cartoonish style. I mean, I call it that because I'm not entirely sure what that art style is or if it has a name. So I'm just going to go with cartoonish. What I mean is the portraits of the characters portray the individuals as in a realistic fashion, in a glorified but somewhat realistic fashion, while the game world is this kind of vibrant, colorful. You can see it in the video, just world, and it's an interesting contrast that I I felt actually worked. I didn't find it odd. It just kind of seemed to work. I went along with it. As for the portraits of the characters, that was an interesting choice because they do start to get tiresome after a while. After playing the game one or two times, well, I would say more than that, but after playing the game for a while, the same faces and pictures for at least an individual faction start to come up again, and they start to get tiresome. The same thing goes for the events and wonders. They do start to kind of feel repetitive, even more so than the portraits, because the artwork for the events and wonders isn't faction specific, so they are kind of just general. So you do see them, even if you're playing a different faction, you see the same thing. The way you progress through the technology tree is also pretty standard stuff, with the added twist of a card draw system. You might want to start researching something like navigation, but you didn't get that card, so you can't research it. So you might want to redraw, which is an option available if your faction leader is a scholar. It's just another one of those little compliments that are found throughout the game that add to everything else that you have to take account while you're playing the game. Some people might find it enjoyable. I personally, it was okay. I don't really think it's a positive or a negative. It just was kind of an added twist to going up the tech tree. Another system in the game worth mentioning is the implementation of the laws, or what the game terms as laws. So, depending on which law you choose, for example, freedom or slavery, you get a different set of bonuses. The idea of setting up a lot of these laws as binaries is an understandable choice, but well, I'll just leave it at setting up a hard distinction between free and slave societies during the time frame covered by this period. To point to one example, is a tough distinction to really make. Admittedly, historical complexity and veracity is probably not one of the top concerns for the developers when thinking about the systems and mechanics of the games. So with that in mind, I do commend them for actually getting me to think about how I understand these, as they term them, laws in their historical context. While I enjoy games that facilitate a little historical contemplation, I believe there was a bit of a missed opportunity here, and I know I'm about to tread on what the game could have been grounds as opposed to what the game actually is, but I feel compelled to say a mythological or magical element to this game would have gone a long way to really distinguishing it as something special. It could have really added another layer of intrigue or engagement to the game world, the events, the characters, and their relationship to one another. They really didn't even have to step away from the historical, as they could have played it from the angle of this is the world as it was perceived or understood by the people at that time. How ancient, even medieval people understood their relationship to the natural world, gods, and each other, at least among the factions included, is really one that lends itself to a dimension of mysticism and an element of the fantastical. So pursuing that route, I felt could have really distinguished this game from the various other games that fall under this grand strategy 4X kind of game. Alright, I said my piece about that, and now it's time to apply my pen-pending, not entirely completely arbitrary point system to the game. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 5 out of 5 coins, but one of those coins is not of the same quality as the others. I suppose 4 out of the 5 coins are made primarily of rare metals, while that last one is primarily made of quark, with an inscription that reads, "Of some value, somewhere, to someone, probably." Well, that just about wraps it up for me. I'll conclude with Old World provided an engaging game world and addictive gameplay for a good while. The game served as my primary entertainment option for probably a week of on and off playing of hour-long sessions, but after that, the game did begin to lose its luster, and I found myself increasingly disinterested in continuing to play it. It's not that the game did anything wrong, but after reading the same events, implementing the same strategy, with minor variations depending on the faction or map, and basically going through just about everything the game had to offer, I had my fill, and it was time to move along. This isn't a bad thing in my book, and it's likely more a result of having already played thousands of hours of this kind of game more than anything else. But that's the thing, isn't it? This kind of game. While I try to avoid direct comparison to other grand strategy games, it just doesn't do enough to really separate itself in my mind from them. In sum, the game just doesn't have enough to make me feel that I'm playing something substantially more different than what has come before it. Oh well, I rambled on long enough. It's not a bad game. A solid entry to the grand strategy 4X genre. Not entirely sure if this falls under 4X genre, but it definitely grand strategy genre. Um, it certainly didn't. Everything that I expected to be there was there, and some. It certainly didn't rekindle. Well, it did rekindle my passion or my interest in this kind of game, but for a limited time. It certainly didn't make me want to go into my week-long, month-long gameplays that I occasionally did for, say, Civilization or Galactic Empires. Um, but it did remind me why I do like these kind of games and why I do find them enjoyable, even if that enjoyment is far more limited in the amount of time I actually spend with the game. So that does it for this video. Thanks for watching or listening, and till next time.